Everyone, and welcome this afternoon to the National Education Union's Councillor Network call. We are not only on a Zoom call today, but we are going out live on Facebook this afternoon as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We realise it's last thing on a Friday, but we hope that you'll find this afternoon's hour really informative, helpful, and that you can ask some questions of us as well. As Mike said, my name is Amanda Martin. I am the president of the National Education Union, and I'm just going to run through some housekeeping for the NEU Zoom call this afternoon. So firstly, we are recording, and because we like to use this to inform ourselves and our policies as we're going forward, we also record the chat and the Q&A in case we miss any questions or if there's anything that we feel we need to put into our own advice and information to go out to you as councillors, but also as our members. In the chat facility, you will find the National Education Union's behaviour code. Please look at that and adhere to that throughout the time of this call this afternoon. We are in webinar format, which means you will only see the panellists and the speakers this afternoon, but we absolutely want you to be involved. We have two ways of you doing that. One is the chat function, where you can say hello, introduce yourselves, also ask for, as Mike said, any technical information that you might wish to know. In addition, we'll post links to our website or links to other things that we're talking about in there as they come up, so that will hopefully be helpful for you. And also there's the Q&A. If you want to ask questions, please ask them in the questions and answers button. Put your name and where you're from, and if there's a particular panelist you want to direct it to, please do that. If not, I as the chair will direct them to the panelists. We have today our tech team on board, and they are Dorothy, Lawson, Andy, Mike and Henry. So thank you very much to them. And thank you once again to Sam Riddle for doing our signing. So this afternoon, we are going to hear from a number of people on the panel, and then we are going to have some time for you to ask questions. So we are going to hear from, first of all, an introduction to the NEu Councilors Network. What do we do and how can you help? And that's Councillor Robyn Hattersley. So welcome, Robyn, this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Amanda. I'm Robyn Hattersley, and I am one of the Northwest co-conveners of the National Education Union, along with Stephen London from Trafford Council. I'm also a Labour councillor in the Borough of St Helens and a trainee primary school teacher at Liverpool Hope University. Firstly, I'd like to thank everyone who's on the call for taking the time to discuss the importance of an education recovery plan, and thank Kevin and Mary for taking the time to run through the National Education Union's 10-point plan and the summer holiday local offer. As a future teacher and a young person myself, I appreciate the hard work that the NEU has been doing to provide clarity and support to educators and local authorities at this current time. St Helens Borough Council, like many councils in the North West, have high numbers of vulnerable and disadvantaged children, and this number has grown exponentially over the past 10 years because of Tory austerity. And the current COVID-19 situation has drew more attention to this and the importance of education for these young people. It is crucial that we begin to build bridges back into education for these young people over the summer break and to make September smoother for educators, parents and pupils. These bridges into education should consist of outdoor play, gardening and sport activities where children can interact with other children in a semi-formal setting. However, where should this take place? With restrictions on public buildings such as leisure centres and libraries still in place, councils cannot plan to use these facilities. In previous years, my council have used the leisure facilities for sports camps and play schemes, but this cannot be part of council's recovery plans until restrictions are lifted at a safe and sensible time. So the burden falls upon schools to volunteer their facilities for summer activities, and local authorities need to pull together resources to collaborate with these schools and to plan with community groups, businesses and other agencies to maximise educational opportunities for these young people over the summer period. A worry of mine in the coming months is that if we don't build the bridges back into education soon, the disadvantage and attainment gap will widen. And if this happens, we cannot let the blame fall upon local authorities and schools. Ofsted may be understanding in the first few months of schools reopening, but as the attainment gap narrows in places like London, North West schools will be questioning why theirs isn't narrowing as quickly. And the answer is simple. Although our vulnerable pupils are resilient, They need the structure and support that school provides them, and being without this safety net for the past few months is likely to have had a massive educational impact on massive educational impact on our children. And the guidance and support that the NEU has provided educators and local authorities over the past few months has been amazing. However, this isn't enough. This government needs to step up and start taking education seriously. We need promises, support and guidance in line with union guidance, along with discussions about overcoming the attainment and disadvantage gap within our schools. As councillors, we face many difficult decisions that are usually down to budgets or lack thereof. And one of the hardest realisations I've had to make is councils like my own must make decisions that ultimately affect vulnerable residents due to tightening budgets. And for this reason, I welcome point 3, which puts the funding of holiday clubs and activities onto central government. It is vital that councils pull together to place pressure on governments to provide adequate funding to deliver suitable services for young people. I'm tired of constant pressure being placed upon local authorities to deliver suitable funding, and I use the words adequate and suitable because the current promises of funding to local authorities are neither adequate nor suitable. St Helens Council's Children's Services budget has been cut by 19 million, and the current funding increases coming to council's way is simply a drop in the ocean compared to what local authorities have lost in the past 10 years, and this cannot be accepted. It is simply not good enough. To conclude, it is vital that councillors up and down the country stand together to support educators and young people, ensuring that bridges back into education are built for our most vulnerable pupils. For this reason, there is no better time than now to join the NEu Councilors Network, as it is a network open to all councillors and a partnership between local government and the National Education Union. Since joining the Councillors Network, I've had the opportunity to work alongside councillors from all areas of the country to fight for our young people and their educational opportunities. I have especially valued the opportunity to be involved in a letter signed by 1,175 councillors that asked for 4 key demands: to have a role in coordinating further opening of schools, free school meal vouchers to be provided for the whole period of school partial closures, guaranteed free school meal vouchers over school breaks, and to only open schools when it's further when it's safe. I strongly urge everyone on this call to join the network and to follow us on social media for regular updates on key educational issues within local authorities, and to share and raise these issues within your councils. We hope to grow the network and plan to work with the profession to place pressure on the government for a national recovery plan, with local authorities at the heart of it. By working with unions and teachers, we can achieve a local authority-led recovery plan that is funded by central government that works for all our young people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Robyn Hattersley, and an impressive list of titles and things you're doing there. But the one that struck out for me, obviously we're on a councillor's call, is trainee teachers. So good luck with that, and I hope you can add NEu member to your list of things that you belong to. But thank you so much for your time. Without further ado, now I will hand over to one of our Joint General Secretaries, Mary. Hi Mary, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Amanda, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this NEu Councilors Network call. I want to talk a little bit about the government's announcement yesterday about school reopening. And the first thing I want to say is the NEu, like parents, like teachers, like leaders throughout the country, want schools to reopen in September, but we want a safe school reopening. We're concerned that if the reopening isn't safe, that it won't last, and that will be in further difficulties in the autumn term. So on the 10th of June, the National Education Union wrote to Boris Johnson with our education recovery plan. And I'll say a bit more about that later. Now, yesterday, the government produced its plan to allow all pupils to return to school full-time in September. And it's a plan, so at least we should be glad we've got something. At least it's something which leaders and can use to plan for full pupil return in September. But the plan relies on 2 central planks: that COVID levels will have dropped further by September. We hope they will. And the plan also requires that test, trace and isolate will be fully functioning and successful. And as the example of Leicester has shown us this week, that is not the case at the moment. But we do hope that both these essential pillars of the government's approach will be established and that we will have firm foundations to build on. But we have real concerns, particularly about test, trace and isolate. We really have concerns about that. We also have very serious concerns about the government's plans, about the plans in the guidance launched by the DfE and by Gavin Williamson yesterday in the House of Commons and in the presentation at 5 o'clock yesterday evening. We think the government's guidance and its approach is rooted in a political imperative rather than in educational reality and in public safety. And we fear that there are some very, very important and really central facts that the government is treating really just as inconvenient truths. So here are some of the inconvenient facts. Our classes are now higher than they have been in a decade, with increasing numbers of pupils taught in classes of over 30. Our classrooms and school sites are some of the smallest in the developed world, with increasing numbers of pupils taught in smaller classrooms. And we have some of the highest pupil-teacher ratios in the OECD. So our teachers teach more pupils than most other developed countries. And the problems about that, when you think about a full return to school in September in the light of a pandemic, become immediately apparent. In most schools, in the vast majority of schools, state schools, there simply is no spare space. There aren't empty spaces where pupils can go. There aren't spaces where classrooms can be divided. There aren't large, wide corridors where children don't pass each other in very close proximity. And that's where the concept of bubbles becomes really important. In primary, the bubbles go up from 15 to 30, which is essentially the whole class. In secondary schools, the concept of bubbles has been stretched beyond any real meaning. So there could be year group bubbles in secondary of up to 240 pupils, which the government says the different year groups must be kept separate. Now, we just think that that is largely impossible. I was on the Sheila Fogarty show on LBC yesterday, and I said, well, keeping year groups separate is largely impossible. And she said, well, why can't the different year groups just change classes at different times? Why can't year 7 change classes at 5 past the hour, and year 8 at 10 past the hour, and year 9 at a quarter past the hour, etc., etc.? And I said, well, that would be fine, but where would they go to? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, if year 7 leave the class at 5 past the hour, and they're going to go to a class, say a form group in year 7, and going to go to a class which is occupied by a year 8 group or by a year 9 group, then all they can do is stand outside the classroom. And then when the year 8 or year 9 do come out of the classroom 5 or 10 minutes later, they'll break another part of the government's guidance, which is that there shouldn't be crowded corridors. It's simply impossible to stagger the school day in that way. Just having staggered starts and staggered lunchtimes will be challenge enough. And the idea, which came out in the original guidance from the DfE, was slightly modified, but not really, that schools can determine who sits where, even on a dedicated school bus, is nonsense. In country areas, how will staggered starts and ends work when the buses are so infrequent? And there will be no bubbles on public transport. So it's no wonder that Robert Peston, the ITV's political correspondent, said last night that the plan for head teachers is mind-blowing and like to give some leaders a nervous breakdown. And indeed, our feedback from our leader members is that Robert Peston is unfortunately right. We don't believe that the current plan in its current form is really workable. Uniquely, the government is seeking to persuade teachers and leaders and support staff that their measures are sufficient to make schools COVID secure and require them to work in classes of 30 or more children with no social distancing, no PPE for 7 to 8 hours a day. And these classrooms are often dilapidated and have poor ventilation. So cleaning them, the cleaning that the government requires, regular cleaning of toilets and of classrooms and of equipment. For example, the guidance says sports equipment to be cleaned meticulously between the different uses and between each bubble using it. outdoor play equipment to be rigorously cleaned. Where is this going to happen? Where schools are largely cleaned by low-paid workers for an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening, and schools are beginning to be given no extra money to do the extra cleaning. When Denmark mandated extra cleaning, schools were paid extra for the cleaning, and extra sinks were built in schools to enable the regular hand washing, which the government says it's required. Now, the danger is, and I made this point directly to Nick Gibb 2 days ago, the schools minister, the danger is that there will be outbreaks in schools, and that with the enormous size of secondary school bubbles and schools' inability to keep groups apart, that when this happens, hundreds of pupils will have to isolate for 14 days. We really hope that this doesn't happen, but we can't, Leicester shows us that we cannot say that it won't happen. And this has huge implications for education next year, particularly for children in year 11 and year 13. Now, when the Education Policy Institute, which is the major education think tank, reacted to the government's announcement yesterday, it said that the government needed a plan B that will allow all pupils to work effectively at home in the winter. All children, not just the current priority groups, must be given home access to IT, laptops, and additional provision for online tutoring as needed. And he said this will be expensive, but it would be even more costly to allow many children to make up the gap in their learning. And we wrote, the National Education Union wrote to the government on the 10th of June, as the councillor speaking before me has said, with a 10-point plan for education recovery, in which we said pressure has to be taken off the school side. So we've got to look at the use of public buildings in order to take pressure off very crowded school sites and allow more social distancing. We said that teachers and supply teachers who have left the profession should be brought back. And in particular, as in Scotland, all newly qualified teachers are being guaranteed a year's work in schools. We know that newly qualified teachers in England are facing a really uncertain future because schools aren't hiring. So why isn't there a guarantee in England that schools will hire and keep newly qualified teachers for the first year? Because that will allow smaller group sizes and it will allow social distancing. We're very concerned that Ofqual's plans for GCSEs and A-levels are essentially do the same exams 3 weeks later. We don't believe that's appropriate. We really believe that you've got to look properly at pupil assessment and student assessment for GCSEs and A-levels to make those qualifications doable and to make them fair for those children who have not been able to work at home, not being able to access online learning. We're absolutely clear that we need proper plans for blended learning. That's plans for learning at home and at school, because in the event of a local outbreak, with children isolating at home, they're going to need to be able to continue to learn at home. And we wrote to the government and said, really, that is a requirement. We're clear that children in poverty and young people need access, as the EPI said, to the internet, and they need laptops enabled to do work at home. And we're also clear that we would have less of a problem with online internet access and with the number of children who can't work at home if there were fewer poor children, less endemic and systemic rates of childhood poverty, which by this Christmas is likely to rise to 4.5 million children. Finally, we think it's a really big ask. The guidance says that teachers should stay 2 meters apart from their pupils. We think that's just impossible in the early years. And in classrooms our size, with the number of pupils, that's impossible. It says that pupils, particularly older pupils, should attempt to stay 1 meter apart from each other. Again, in schools our size, with classrooms so small, we think that is largely impossible. So our fear is the government has come up with a plan which is designed not with England's schools in mind, not with England's pupil numbers in mind, and not with our pupil-teacher ratios in mind. We fear, despite us all wanting the return to school in September to be a great success, we fear that that will create huge problems. And we want the government to take our plan seriously because we think in the end, it may well be needed.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. And please start bringing your questions in now. But before we do ask any questions, we're just going to hear from three councillors who are going to give us an insight into their world. and we are going to be hearing from Judith Blake, who is the Labour leader for Leeds Council. We are going to be hearing from Lucy Nethsingha, who is the LGA Lib Dem group leader. We are going to be hearing from Councillor Anntoinette Bramble, who is a Cabinet Member for Education, Young People and Children's Services in Hackney. And we're also going to be hearing from Lowthion, the Green Party Education Spokesperson. So I'm going to be coming to Judith first. Welcome. Good afternoon, Judith.
Good afternoon, everyone. And it's great to be on the call and to see so many members from right across the country representing a whole range of different backgrounds, different experiences. And can I just say to Mary, well done for keeping going. You've suffered an incredible onslaught over the last few weeks, and I had the privilege of being on different calls with you and really know what you've been facing. So, you know, from all of us, keep going. Just to say, from a local authority perspective, you know, for the last 10 years, I think we've been facing an onslaught from an ideological point of view to really distance councils having any involvement in education at all. And suddenly we come into a crisis situation and all these expectations are then put back to councils. And I think that's something that we would actually welcome, but of course we haven't got the necessary resource or the powers that we need to be able to fulfill the role that we would all love to play to our fullest potential. You know, in England, we're living in the most centralised country in Europe, and I would say that the Department for Education actually probably is in very good competition for being the most centralised department within government. And the idea, from my perspective, that you can run schools from Whitehall has to be one of the most nonsensical ideas that we've ever had to endure. And I pay tribute to all of those councils out there who have, against all the odds, kept an education function, recognising just how important it is. And of course, the lead councillors, the cabinet members who've got responsibility for children and young people, have a statutory responsibility. They're the only executive members that have those responsibilities for the well-being of children within their districts, and that doesn't matter where those children are, what type of school they're in, and that is a very serious responsibility. It's absolutely crucial that in this agenda, bringing children back into school, which all of us want to see happen safely, we have to take account not only their educational needs, but also well-being, social care, mental health, and the fact that so many more, as Mary said, will be experiencing real poverty at home. I think one of the biggest regrets from the announcement that's been made in terms of support from government is that they haven't taken our plea for supporting summer holiday activities seriously. You know, there is one thing asking kids to come and engage in learning, but there's another thing coming to ask them to engage in fun activities, football, drama, you know, whatever we could do which would re-engage kids, and then our qualified youth workers, etc., could assess some of the real needs that those young people will have from their experience of being in lockdown. And we know we're expecting some really serious issues coming forward, and it's working with councils that brings together that rounded picture and experience that can actually then support schools with the job they need to do of getting kids learning again. But from a, you know, we've argued, you know, for the free school meal entitlement to be continued. I know there've been problems with the system, but you know, it's because of the pressure we put on as well. You know, that has actually enabled that to be established, which I think is really important. My real concerns as a councillor are the unaddressed issues around school transport that we're going to have to face, and absolute nonsense, you know, in terms of the numbers of buses, social distancing on buses, staggered entry. Where are these vehicles going to come from for a start, and how are we going to manage that without having a clear understanding of the plan? And as has been mentioned, a real concern about the lack of attention to the additional resources that schools are going to need, whether it's in additional staffing, all of the health and safety regulations, just the sheer fact of hand washing, will it be hand washing or sanitizers? A note to teachers that most of the sanitizers are made of 60% alcohol. I think that's something that we need to bear in mind. And just on the bubbles, obviously, some of us represent areas where schools are massive compared to what we've been led to believe. And I don't think there's a real understanding of the different scale of schools that we're facing. But has any consideration been given to the fact that the vast majority of kids in school have siblings in schools which will be in different bubbles? How is that going to be addressed? So I think I just end really on the fact that we know we have to prepare probably for the whole winter of living with the virus in our communities. And all councils are taking very seriously the whole issue about testing, tracing, containing. And actually, my chief executive has been involved in putting the local authority perspective into government, and actually has made a lot of progress in getting central government to understand what, what local authorities can bring and what we need to be able to do the job. So whilst it's still far from perfect, we are making some breakthrough in recognising that it has to be done locally. And obviously we're trying desperately to avoid further lockdowns coming back into place. So a lot of work to share on that, and very, very happy to do that. But we have Zoom calls with our head teachers in Leeds, over about 200 head teachers. And there was one today with Dr. Butler. I don't know if any of you have come across the work that they've been doing around how we actually live with the virus, and the fact that a second peak is very likely, and how we can move forward with confidence. Things like using outdoor space more in schools, keeping windows open. What about the heating bills? Face covering, all of those things, and just basic health and safety matters. A huge agenda of things that we have to cover. So a massive agenda, but just to reassure, that all the unions on the call, and thank you for everything you're doing, that as councils, we're here, we want to step up, and we want to work with you to make sure that we achieve our objective of safely returning all children and young people to education across the sectors, early years, schools, FE as well. Thank
you, Judith, very much. And I was going to say this to the end, but Joyce McCarthy, you noticed exactly what I noticed. It's always been an honour and a privilege to be the president of the National Education Union, to serve on panels, and you are exactly right. This is a union and a political panel full of just women. The NEU do what they say they do, and we push women forward in the union movement, and we like to promote our women councillors as well. So you are all welcome, and I think, yes, we should be appreciated for that. So thank you very much, Joyce, for pointing that out. Thank you, Judith. Lots of things to consider then, and I'm sure when we come to the questions there'll be very many things for us to discuss. Next I'm going to be bringing in Lucy Nethsingha, and she's the LGA Liberal Democrat group leader. Welcome, Lucy. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm going to have to correct you very slightly. I'm our group leader on the Children and Young People's Board, not across the whole. And I'm also a councillor in Cambridgeshire, and until recently a teacher. So I can see this from all sides of the equation. And my goodness, there's an awful lot for teachers to have to be dealing with at the moment, and for schools to be dealing with. First of all, I'd like to say that I agree with everything that Judith says about the role that councils, the way that councils have been pushed out of education, but suddenly when there's a crisis, we're expected to step back in again. And my goodness, councils have done that. They have done it incredibly well. And the way that councils across the whole country have worked together with schools to try and support schools in the impossible position they've been put in has been fantastic. But it has really highlighted the failures in the way that the system at the moment is working. The second thing I want to say is just how amazing our young people have been across this country. They've been dealt such a rough deal over the past few years. They've been utterly ignored on climate change and Brexit and a whole load of other political issues. They've had extraordinary changes to their exam system thrown at them, huge amounts of additional content shoved in, massive pressure on them in terms of 100% exams, and now suddenly all of that's out of the window because there's a pandemic and they've had to stay at home. And there's been some talk about the way our young people have behaved. I think they have been fantastic, and I think it's really important to put that on the record. The second thing I want to say is that, how angry I am at the fact that the DfE are daily missing the opportunity to try and make sure that that there are summer activities available for children. I think that their failure to grasp that and the importance of that is really appalling. I mean, it would not have been difficult to give many after-school clubs, out-of-school clubs, the kind of support that they need so that they can run some kind of service over the summer. But as days go past and that support is not there, the likelihood of those clubs not running is higher and higher every day. And that's going to have a further impact on isolating children and making things more difficult for families who need childcare over the summer. I think it's just shocking that the lack of interest in the DfE in that whole side of provision for children. When the children do eventually go back in September, and I think it's really sad that so few of them have been able to go back until now, and I think that again the DfE have failed miserably in making it possible for more children to go back into school for at least a little bit of time, because actually a little bit of time makes a big difference for some children. I think that it's really clear that pastoral care and support and looking after mental health needs to be one of the top priorities for school. And I'm concerned that actually the messages coming out from government about fining families are not going to make that any easier. Actually, we need our young people to come back into school to feel that they're being supported, not that they're being forced back in. And then I think the next thing that is enormously important is that it's recognised that children should come into school for education and not just for childcare. And that education can be delivered well at home, and that blended learning has been quite impressive in some cases, and that we need to be focusing on all the things that can be done rather than simply saying everything has to try and go back to normal, because actually it's not going to be normal in September. There are going to be an awful lot of families for whom life is very far from normal, particularly those where there are health issues and family members to be shielded. And making sure that children under those circumstances don't feel even more isolated is just as important as bringing others back into school. Moving on, I think, so one of the things actually is that if we're looking at that blended learning model, we also have to think about all the opportunities that there are for looking at education in new ways, and potentially being much more flexible in the ways in which schools all over the country offer learning to different individuals. There are quite a lot of young people who find school quite stressful. I think it's important for them to come into school. I think that the socialisation and the seeing friends is very important for young children and for older children, but they don't necessarily, I think one of the things we're learning is that they don't necessarily need to be in school all the time to have good educational outcomes. And there are things that we can learn from the blended learning that schools are introducing. Some of the opportunities there are really quite exciting for supporting children with their learning at home. And for the government to be just ignoring that is really unhelpful. I think that the work from the Education Policy Institute on the need for schools to plan for blended learning is absolutely right. And the priority of making sure that all children are able to access that is also right. We also need to recognise that for some children, working at home is going to be something that they enjoy and something that they do well and are good at. And for other children, they simply don't have the space. They don't have that quiet place where they can do some work, and that making sure that those children have the opportunities and the support that they need is critical, and that there will not be a one-size-fits-all, and that some children will need different support from others, and we're not getting any of that flexibility from the government at the moment. So those blended learning opportunities can be opportunities as well as problems. I think the final thing I want to say is that our education sector, as Judith says, has been underfunded and under-resourced for years, and those cracks in the system are being shown up by the COVID crisis, just in the same way that they are in the care sector and in so many other areas of our public services. And we need to make sure that we get the investment that is needed, and that we come out of this crisis in a better position from the way in which we went into it. I hope that can be the case. I'm not over hopeful with this government, but that's what we need to be aiming for. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lucy. And you know, some really good insight into the difficulties of local government, and realising the impact that this is having, and the various things you're having to juggle. Okay, next up is Vix Lowthion, who is the Green Party spokeswoman. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Amanda. The aim of this session being working together as part of a national recovery is critical, but sadly I think this government are failing in too many ways to work with other people, not just political parties, not just the unions, but clearly the local authorities as well, in order to build an effective recovery. I'm a secondary school teacher and an NEu member, and I'm a parish councillor. And I can see that the real heroes that we've had have been in our local communities, our local voluntary groups and our schools. And this task we've got ahead of building back better is absolutely huge. The NEU's 10-point plan is spot on. There's so much that's good about that. There's really clear, really bold, and really progressive. However, in some respects, it doesn't go far enough. For once, we've seen Green Party policies through pressure and through a horrendous crisis being put into place in some of our schools. Classes of under 20, 15, that's Green Party policy. Scrapping SATs, scrapping baseline tests, Green Party policy. Outdoor learning, Green Party policy. So many opportunities to focus on learning outside of a prescribed national curriculum, Green Party policy. That's why our national education funding and recovery plan has got to go even further. And it's so disappointing that the governments have sectioned this just into education, because you can't section this off into a brief cabinet role. You've got to work across ministerial roles outside of Westminster, and you've got to put a lot more funding into that recovery across different units. So it's not just an education issue. Young people who are leaving education, year 11, year 13, they have lost so many opportunities for employment, so many opportunities to travel, so many opportunities to study. We need a recovery programme for the under 30s. Schools don't exist in a vacuum. The cuts to our leisure and sporting facilities, and particularly the arts industry, that needs a big recovery plan, because that's going to have a huge impact, particularly on the creative subjects in our schools. And Boris Johnson this week made a commitment for build, build, build. I welcome that. As a parish councillor, I spent 2019 focusing on securing priority building programme 2 funding for our village primary school, a Victorian building with water coming through and so on. It's welcome news, but at the same time, building where? On what green spaces? Getting rid of nuke counting means getting rid of wildlife protection. So we need a recovery programme for the environment too. And the SEND children, our special schools, they cannot be lumped in with all the other schools. They've got real specific needs. Our autistic children, that has been completely overlooked. And it's the local authority that unfortunately are going to have to try and find ways in which to support, because the government clearly aren't. And finally, the blended learning at home. We need the technology, we need the laptops, but it also shines a light on how we need the spaces in the school, in our housing. The houses that some of our young people are having to learn in just do not have the space, the quiet space, and some of them are just not fit for habitation in that way. So we need a national recovery plan for local councils and for the housing. Our local authorities have a huge amount of briefs that cover so many of those issues. which affect all our families and all our communities. The local councillors have such a huge responsibility, and the government are not reflecting on that enough in terms of investment and funding, which needs to be opened up. I know it's quite optimistic of me, but I think a national recovery plan for education based on the NEu 10-point plan lines, plus Green Party education policies on class sizes, ending over testing, outdoor learning, and the local authorities with investments can look at housing, green spaces, SEND, and the youth offers, which have been drastically cut by national government cuts. If we can work together like that, that's exactly the sort of recovery that we should be able to do. But it requires much more support and recognition and honesty coming from government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vix. Some really clear ideas there, and yep, some of those contained absolutely within the 10-point plan as you go into the more detail. Last but absolutely not least is Councillor Anntoinette Bramble. She is the Cabinet Member for Education, Young People and Children's Services in Hackney. Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon, thank you, Chair. I was just thinking that if working together was a test for government, they would be in a lot of trouble, because actually the first test is how did you respond to children in learning during COVID? Well, they were slow to listen, slow to plan, and slow to respond. So they failed the first test. So, okay, let's look at mocks then. What's the second test? Well, the second test is about how we get all children back to school in September. Well, actually, they've failed that test as well. If there was a third test for government, are children at the heart of the decision making when we're talking about learning in schools? They have failed again. In all of the decisions that government has made, and every time you hear them talking about children, there is no discussion around health and well-being, no real in-depth, integral discussion about their learning. It's more around recovery, and actually looking at the financial recovery of businesses and getting adults back to work, and then schools and children being an afterthought of actually, in order for more people to get back to work, we have to have schools open. I think that the pandemic has put us in a situation where we can really reevaluate what's going on in our schools, because actually, we've had to go from a model that's really focused on exams. Exams have been scrapped this year, and it's all assessment focused. So there's a real opportunity to reevaluate what we're doing in our schools alongside that. Any recovery plan has to focus and feature the health and well-being of children, staff, and parents. That has got to be the foundation, because actually what you've noticed is that schools have become, again, the centre hubs for local communities in the work that they're doing. I know that many of our local schools weren't just providing free school meal for a child. Some of them were developing school parcels that could feed the whole family, because teachers were telling me they didn't feel comfortable a child sitting down at a table eating and then feeling bad because they couldn't share the food with the family. I think Mary was generous with the government's plan. The NEu has set out a clear recovery and national plan. Government haven't done that. I think they need to form a task force with teachers, unions. They need the voice of young people and the voice of parents and local authorities around what should that national framework look like. And that national framework has to come and take into consideration transportation, bridging the gap, the digital divide, the logistics within the system, and training for teachers. I mean, I used to be a teacher. I've been out of the classroom over 10 years ago. I was a nursery nurse before that. And while I've got an understanding, I do not pretend that I understand the challenges a classroom teacher has today under the impact of COVID. We can't make assumptions that when we're talking about supporting children at home learning, that a teacher's just going to know what that looks like. I have not heard government talk about training. I'm very concerned about that. We've got to think about that. We've also got to think about how we support parents in all of this. Parents are dealing with homeschooling and having to work and are carrying immense amount of guilt around with them because they are equally concerned about learning. We have to think about the gap some data saying that actually there could be up to a 75% attainment gap. And research from the National Foundation of Education Research is saying that when they spoke to head teachers, they believe only a third of children are engaging with the learning. So any national plan has to think about how we respond to COVID. Now, we all want to work together to get all children back in September, but we are acutely aware when we had to even think about the thinking through of getting extra year groups back in school, the challenges and the hurdles that we had to overcome. So now when we're talking about whole systems and whole schools, although we're all willing, it's going to be a challenge. So we have to think about a hybrid approach. What does it look like when all children are back? And great if that happens, but if it doesn't, what does that offer look like with some children at school, some children at home? What does that mean in terms of our teaching capacity? What does that mean in terms of the digital divide? In Hackney, we've just been given out our laptops, but we don't have enough dongles to go with all the laptops. So that's great. Here's your shiny new iPad, children, but we'll worry a bit later how you can then finance using it to download all the work that you need. We'll think about that later, but thumbs up, Boris, because you've sent some laptops. So the government need to really invest in what's going forward. So we need a hybrid model, some children back in school, some at home, support for teachers and training, because actually if you're teaching children in their home and you as a teacher are letting children into your home, we have to think about the logistics of this. I think that the government have missed an opportunity to work with those that are closest to the issues. And I think that they've spent so much time eroding roles. So for example, they've moved the role of the local authority further and further from schools. But in the pandemic, we are now the middle tier. As Judith, I think, said, we're happy to fill that role, but actually we need the funding and the legislative powers to make decision-making that we need at a local level. Any national framework for children going back to school has to be able to respond on a regional level, a local authority level, but more importantly, at a school level, and have that flexibility. So I really just want to commend the work that the union are doing on this, because they are actually doing the thinking that government have left behind. I think the government have got a lot to answer for here, but in the interim, absolutely stand behind the NEU to fill the gap so we can get children back to school, we can get teachers feeling supported and not worried about returning to work, worried that they will get sick, but more importantly, make their families sick, and taking the pressure of parents who are not teachers, who have been left with the responsibility of educating their children because the government has been too busy taking local decision ways at a local level or making it at national level, and then not focusing on what they should be doing at a national level, which is having a national recovery plan for children back in school. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bramble, and thank you very much. We agree. We think there should be a task force. It's what we've been asking for since lockdown started. It's what's happened before in other countries that have been successful, such as Denmark, going back. Okay, I've got some questions that I'm going to come through. Some of them, I'm sorry to the councillors, are pretty NEU orientated, but I guess it's why people have come on the call to ask some key questions. So I'll take three to start with. Luke Frost has asked, with over 200 changes of guidance by the government since the COVID outbreak, it's actually 300, how do we put our trust in the new guidance, and or do we look to a more local model ensuring that schools are suitable and fit for purpose? That's the first one. And then Matthew Holbert has asked, schools can't and shouldn't be expected to do everything. As part of a holistic education, does the government also not need to urgently refund the youth service and youth workers? And I know that was touched on. And Catherine Arnold, are the NEU lobbying the government around additional mental health support funding that will be directly needed within our schools post-COVID? And in fact, I'll take those three first. So Mary, can I come to you first?
Yes, so I'll answer those quickly. So Luke's question, can we trust the government guidance? The latest iteration of the government guidance is so unworkable that you can't trust it, no. And absolutely, local authorities and schools should take the confidence to do what they can do And that will mean, you know, for many schools that they cannot have all children fully back in September. Now, the government's making threatening noises about that, but in the end, they won't be able to, you know, carry out their threats. If it is just simply impossible to follow the DfE guidance, poor though it is, with and to have all children back, then that is just impossible. And schools and local authorities and local areas are going to have to be looking at that, and that will be the case if there's a second spike, or unique circumstances will have to be thought through. So yes, you should have the confidence to be looking at what is possible in your area and making those arrangements. And I think what Antoinette, it's the first time I've ever been accused of being too kind on the government. So I hope that there's somebody recording that in the interest of balance. And Catherine, are we lobbying the government around mental health support? Yes, we are. We've really worked hard on what learning should look like in September. And in particular, we think that many children will have suffered trauma. We're asking in our plan for a national programme of support and counselling for children in all schools, because some of them will have been through extremely traumatic experiences. In particular, some of them will have relatives dying. Some of them will have suffered some terrible things happening in their home, and they need support, and they need mental health support, but social support, emotional support, in order to deal with the trauma that they've been through. And we've said, yes, as a holistic education, we should be looking, particularly in the summer, I think Judith mentioned this particularly, around youth workers and around a proper, serious summer holiday offer, which is what the NEu clearly asked for in its recovery plan.
Thank you. And just to add on that to something that Mary said, just to cover the rest of Matthew's question, and that was absolutely, we believe that our 10-point plan should be funded in the same way as the jobs recovery programme. This is not a skim. You can't skim this. It's got to be done properly. And if the people that stood there and said vulnerable kids and our kids' education matter, then they need to start putting the money where their mouth is, and that's what the NEu believe in their 10-point plan. I've got 2 questions now, and I'm going to come to each of the councillors for kind of a 1-minute, 2-minute feedback on those questions. So I'm going to ask all of you this question. So there's 2 of them. So firstly is Lavina O'Connor. It is clear that the government has been trying to force a wedge between teachers, parents, the public and the NEu. You might not know, but the NEu has been mentioned at least 3 times now in Parliament. So that's interesting. Now more than ever, we need the union. What more can we do to support this union going forward, and obviously other education unions? And then Mike Roberts, the LGA all group agreed that the shortfall in councils was the need for another 6 billion, but the government gives us 500 million. So how are LAs going to square the circle? What about the growing inequality, as Marmot was saying last week at the LGA, and those who suffer inequalities are facing a worse situation, whether in cities or outside? So I'm going to come to the councillors and Vix for all of those, and I'll start with you. I'll start with you, Deputy Mayor Bramble, first.
Thank you. You're right. The LGA has identified there is a gap in terms of what local authorities and schools need for education and actually what the government's giving. You've also got to remember schools are going in before the pandemic in a deficit. Remember, money was already coming away from schools. Schools were having to let go of teaching assistants. They've had to have teachers that were history trained, teaching geography. So on the caveat of that, they are receiving additional pressures. And you're right, we just need to keep lobbying government and reminding them of that gap. I think that Robyn will set out how you can support the NEu. Just going back to the point before about mental health, that is so key. The quick thing that I keep saying is that we normally say to each other, how are you? And we all say we are fine. There is nothing fine about living through a pandemic. Children are going to go back to school. Some of their teachers, some of their friends will not be there because of this pandemic. That is not an easy or straightforward thing to be able to manage, and the government needs to fund that. And also for teachers, I think it should be mandatory. Even if you go to a session and you find that you're okay, teachers are having to deal with a lot in all of this, and I'm really concerned that their health and well-being hasn't been talked about enough.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Robyn Hattersley, thank you. Did you like to come in and kind of give us a summary on those questions?
Yes, so what Lavinia was saying about how we can support the wedge that's being built between parents, teachers and the NEU, quite simply, as councillors, we need to all join together and we need to be fighting for common goals, and we need to be listening to what the NEU is saying, because quite frankly, they're the only people that are speaking any sense in education at the moment. So by joining the Councillors Network, we can share our ideas and share our thoughts and feelings about what the central government are doing at the moment, and fight for more support for our educators, our young people, and for our councils. And that is the only way that we're going to get through to central government, is by all working together. So I do urge everyone again to join the network, to follow us on social media, to really get involved, because we do all need to be working together and saying to central government that we don't agree with their position currently in education and it's not good enough. And I'd like to agree with what Deputy Mayor Bramble said about Mike's question. Obviously, we went into the pandemic in a deficit, and the government are saying that they're going to give us money, but it's not enough. It's not acceptable. It's simply a drop in the ocean compared to what we lost since 2010. And we need to be saying that. We need to be standing together, and we need to be saying we need more support for all council services, especially education.
Thank you, Councillor Robyn. Can I come to Vix now, please?
Hi, thanks. I think when we're looking at disadvantaged children, it's because coronavirus crisis is showing us what was already there, and quite often that was hidden underneath the surface. This huge amount of disadvantage. Mary said, 4.5 million children in poverty by Christmas, and that may well increase as the furlough scheme we come out of the furlough scheme. This government lack imagination. The focus being on pubs opening at 6 a.m. tomorrow, rather than getting children back into places where they can begin a recovery with adults and their peers. The government seems to lack empathy and compassion. It's a focus on the economy and not on wider qualities and values of society that all of us here this afternoon share. Just to go quickly back to the question about what the guidance being unworkable, I think it flags up two things. On the one hand, our education system is massively divided and hierarchical, with different academy chains and federations and things that don't work for them. At the same time as the government is trying to impose a really centralised solution and not empower or trust local authorities. And the local authority education has been decimated, and being able to pick that up now is incredibly difficult for the local authorities to do. And finally, teachers, parents, unions, government all working together. I know that there is a Parents for Safe Return group that has been established and set up, and I think it's the 14th of July is the next meeting, a Zoom meeting for that. So it's worth checking them out as we start to get more of a voice for parents, because most parents are teachers, councillors, but they haven't had a unified voice. So I urge people to get involved in that too.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Lucy, can I come to you, please?
Thank you. So on the question about the government trying to force a wedge between teachers and parents, I think they did try and do that. I don't think it was that successful when they started. I think there were many parents who were also very concerned about the safety of returning to school. And I think that any credit that the government might have had with parents was quite quickly overturned this week with the things that they were saying about fining parents who were not willing to send their children back. So I really don't think that the government's credibility with parents is particularly good at the moment. That's my perception. On the LGA shortfall of 6 billion, Mike is absolutely right that councils are really struggling at the moment. That having not had the sorts of education, the cuts in councils' education departments have been huge, but the cuts in other areas of council work have also been enormous. It really worries me that we're now going to have huge rising need in pretty much all authorities. There are very few councils which don't have serious areas of deprivation within them, and the need in those areas is already incredibly high, and it's likely to get significantly higher. The fact that we don't have the children's centres and the youth work that we did have 10 years ago is a massive problem, and I think that the problems that we're going to have coming out of this crisis in councils with the losses that we're facing, with dropping council tax, lack of business rates, lack of income from all sorts of areas, on top of those years of cuts, is going to be really, really difficult. So I think the only way to try and manage that is for councils and schools and all sorts of public sector to work together, and we need to try and make sure that we're doing that. Thank you, Lucy. And Councillor Judith Blake.
Thank you, Amanda. So the first question from Lavina, I think they really did attempt to put a wedge between us all, and actually I think our collective response really took them by surprise, and they weren't expecting, you know, just how forcibly we would all stand together. And you know, teachers were reflecting concerns of parents, parents reflecting concerns of kids, you know, and everything going around. So from a council perspective, councils can provide the glue to bring everyone together. Our convening power is often underestimated. So let's really step up to the plate and really provide the spaces where all of the different groups can come together and work out local solutions, because that's what's going to get us through. And of course, all of us, I think, would support a recruitment drive to get, you know, more and more, make sure all teachers and non-teaching staff who are in this debate as well signed up to joining unions, so we've got, you know, an even stronger voice going forward. Mike's absolutely right, and you know, just to give you some context, even with the extra support that came through yesterday, Leeds alone is facing a £58 million shortfall this year, and most likely a £90 million shortfall next year. It is stark, and we've already, you know, spent the last 10 years arguing about how short-sighted the whole austerity agenda has been, you know, and the direct link to raising inequalities that Armut brilliantly lays out. And it's no surprise to us the impact of the virus has hit the most hardest in the areas of real inequality that so many of us get. So as obviously across the whole of the local government family, we're arguing our case, but I think we've got to get not the usual suspects arguing on our behalf as well. I was on a call yesterday with the CBI, and you know, when you've got Carolyn Fairburn arguing with government that they have to support local authorities because we are the key to the recovery, resetting, however you want to describe it, that's a powerful ally, and we need to make sure with the unions, councils and business working together. Also, the voluntary and community sector are facing wipeout, and all councils support the third sector hugely. And if we haven't got the money, if we've only got money to support our statutory services, then there's going to be a lot more problems going forward. So it's a question of all coming together, making the case, articulating it, and not giving up, and keeping going, fighting for what we know we need to deliver for our communities.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Judith, Councillor Judith Blake, for that brilliant contribution. Mary, did you want to finish off with anything before I sum up?
Well, it has been a torrid time. I've been on the front page of the Daily Mail twice in the last month, and in a way where I barely recognise myself. And as Judith knows, because she was on the panel after me, I had a wonderful time in front of the Education Select Committee, where Tory MPs were, well, in one of them admitted it, ranting, which is what it was a rant. So it has been pummelling and exhausting, but I think that they have been able to drive a wedge between us, and I don't think parents are impressed at all. I'm afraid I think they will bring themselves into disrepute because of their completely inadequate planning for September. They will bring themselves into disrepute, and we will have to be there then to pick up the pieces and to come back with a plan that does work.
Thank you, Mary, and absolutely echo. And as the president of the National Education Union, I believe that we have absolutely acted on the right side of history, what's done right for the pupils, the communities that you all serve. We never stopped schools opening. We pushed right from the beginning to keep them open for our key worker and vulnerable kids, and because it was the right thing to do. And we've wanted to help to open. We've wanted to find a way. And when we weren't listened to, we produced our own 10-point plan, which we hope will be looked at and be used. For you, I think, thank you very much for your time. I've run 4 minutes over and I apologise. This today, we launched the NEu Councilors Network 2 years ago in 1 day. So, and since that launch, we've had 4,000 councillors sign up. So that is absolutely brilliant. At the moment, we've got 1,000 followers on Twitter. I guess for you, what my ask would be, because I always give an ask at the end, is to get your colleagues to join. Get your colleagues to join, not only just in your councils, but other council colleagues when you go on training, when you look at things and linked with the LGA. Please get your other councillor colleagues to sign up and have a look at our 10-point plan. The summer holiday recovery plan we haven't even touched on today, but it is in there, and it is about helping local authorities to organise and to get government funding. That's what we're pushing for. So have a look at the 10-point plan, how that can work. Work with people in your area, work with your local unions, work with your NEU, find your NEU representative and get them to come along and have a conversation with your councillors and with your groups. If you can't get it, if your council is against that, then get it in your own political groupings and get someone to come along from the union to have a conversation about what our 10-point plan looks like. Thank you very much for your time this evening, and thank you so much for all of your hard work that you are doing. We realise how very, very difficult sometimes being in local council can be, particularly when it comes to education and the very, very minimal budgets that we're now faced with. But thank you very much for your time. Please let us know if there's anything further we can do. I know that Chris Brown is someone you can contact through. But have a good evening and a good weekend. Thank you.